Good morning, everyone. This is Representative Carolyn Partridge at the CSG ERC annual meeting, and this is a meeting of the Ag and Rural Affairs Committee. And I'm going to be chairing this today with my good friend and colleague, Senator Judy Schwenk from Pennsylvania. Judy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, Carolyn, and good morning, everyone. I'm State Senator Judy Schwenk. I represent the 11th District in Pennsylvania, which is about 90 miles from Philadelphia, but also quite rural, believe it or not, and certainly have some issues with broadband, as many of you I know who are on this call. So this has been an issue for those of us in rural and agriculture affairs committees, throughout CSG and all of our states. So I'm very anxious, Carolyn, to hear what we're going to learn today, and got some top-notch experts. So I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And you are so right about the importance, not only to just being able to communicate with each other, but things like precision agriculture for those of us who are in agriculture. Our topic today is broadband mapping, charting the digital divide. And we know that a lack of high-speed broadband access has been a significant problem in rural areas of our eastern regional for years. COVID has highlighted the problem and made it even more urgent. Maps exist for each state showing what counties have access to the internet at minimum speeds. These maps are the basis for federal allocation of dollars to states and counties to enable them to expand high-speed internet access to the last mile. The maps have been proven to be notoriously incorrect. Today, we have three speakers who will address this issue of broadband mapping to discuss the problem and possible solutions. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Kirk Burgee, and he is the FCC Chief of Staff of the Wireline Competition Bureau. In his work for the Bureau, Kirk is involved in matters related to broadband deployment, including broadband data mapping and interagency coordination of broadband programs. Kirk is also Deputy Director of the FCC's Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, which is tasked with implementing FCC auctions to allocate universal service support for broadband deployment in unserved areas, including the Connect America Phase 2 auction and the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 auction. Prior to joining the FCC in 2005, Kirk practiced telecommunications law in the private sector in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Kirk, and thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you, Representative Partridge. Appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to talk to you today about our mapping efforts. I really enjoy these sessions. In addition to getting our message out, it's really helpful and important for us to hear your input about what you're experiencing, and I look forward to that. Let me just pull up my slides. Okay. So some background, some of this may be familiar to many of you. We currently collect at the FCC, collect broadband deployment data using our FCC Form 477, which added deployment as a collection metric in around 2013. On the Form 477, fixed broadband service providers report their deployment based on U.S. Census block geographies, which are more than 11 million, varying in size between urban and rural areas. And the issue with that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of, is that the census blocks are reported in a binary fashion. So if service is offered in the census block at any location, then the census block is considered served. And that's obviously a significant shortcoming in terms of understanding what's happening on the ground. Mobile broadband service providers report their deployment by technology and based on minimum advertised speed, where consumers should reasonably expect to receive that speed. But there is in the Form 477, a lack of standardization in reporting requirements for mobile providers. So acknowledging these problems, Congress directed us through the Broadband Data Act to implement a new broadband data collection that addresses these issues. I should say, so that despite its shortcomings, the Form 477 has a couple of things in its favor. One of which is that it's nationwide, and it applies the same collection requirements nationwide. It's also mandatory, and I think in those two respects it's unique, and those are two very valuable aspects of the collection, in the sense that providers are subject to enforcement implications if they don't report accurately, and we have information about the entire country. Both of those attributes, that is the nationwide and the mandatory aspects, are included in our new data collection, which is called the Broadband Data Collection. So that carries forward, in addition to a lot of other improvements that I'll talk about in a minute. So just some key dates. The Broadband Data Act was passed in March of last year, and it specified how we should collect broadband data, along with other elements, including challenge and verification of the data. We released a second report and order and a further notice of proposed rulemaking in July of last year that established the basic foundation for reporting of the fixed and mobile broadband deployment data. It adopted the broadband serviceable locations fabric, which I'll talk about in a moment, and also adopted processes for verifying the data. In December of last year, Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which, among many other things, allocated about $100 million to the FCC to pay for the massive IT systems that are necessary to implement the requirements of the Broadband Data Act. In January of this year, we adopted another the third report and order that adopted further refinements and a challenge processes for the fixed and mobile deployment data. Also delegated additional technical challenge and verification methodologies to the bureaus and offices to work out. In February of this year, the acting chairwoman, Rosenworcel, created the Broadband Data Task Force, which was a task force within the FCC that is dedicated to the implementation of the requirements of the Broadband Data Act, and is drawing on the expertise and the resources of almost every bureau or office within the FCC. So it's in addition to the task force, it's a very broad effort within the agency. A lot of people working on this. It's a very high priority for the chairwoman. So here's kind of an overview of what the new collection will consist of. On the left, what we have are the inputs essentially to the data collection. The first and foremost is the provider data. So this is the new deployment data that we will be collecting on the fixed and mobile side. The big differences there for the fixed side is that the data will be collected on a basis that allows determination of whether a given location has broadband service deployed to it. And that can be accomplished in one of three ways on the fixed side. The providers may file shape files, that is mapped shapes that will depict the area, that can be overlaid onto a geographic map to show where their service is deployed as I say, on a geographic basis. So any location that they are claiming to serve must be within the shapefile that they submit to us, and any location that is not served needs to be outside of that shapefile. They may also provide us as an alternative with lists of addresses or locations, that is geographic coordinates of locations that they serve. And for terrestrial fixed wireless providers, that is wireless internet service providers, they may supply us with shapefiles based on propagation studies of their transmitters. So there's a specified set of parameters that are used to develop what's called a propagation model that is also essentially a shapefile that needs to encompass only those locations that they can actually serve, that either actually do serve or could serve within 10 business days of a customer request for service. The next data source that will go into the map is an important one for this presentation. It's local and state government data. That is data deployment data submitted by entities that are primarily engaged in broadband mapping, may submit data to us that will be included as a layer in the broadband map that we create based on the data collection. The data will be submitted in essentially the same form as the providers do, that is either via shapefile or in the form of addresses or locations. And it needs to be verified by the state or local governmental entity. That is, they must have a process not just to accept provider data, but also to verify it in addition to the provider's account of where deployment exists. Similarly for tribal governments, it's essentially the same idea. We would accept as a layer in the map deployment data from tribal governments that are primarily engaged in mapping it. We also will accept federal government data from other federal agencies. We're working closely currently with other agencies that fund broadband to ensure that our efforts are coordinated, and they collect a number of different data sets pursuant to their efforts. And so that is a data resource that we will be working into the map that we will be creating based on the collection. Also, third parties may, if they meet certain criteria, can submit deployment data to us, and public data. So this is a key difference that we'll be implementing in the new collection that isn't present currently for the Form 477. There are formal processes through which stakeholders, members of the public and others, governments can do this as well, can submit formal challenges to provider data, which initiates a formal process through which the provider must respond to a challenge. And there is a process for resolving each challenge so that it's a check on the accuracy of the deployment data, which, as I say, is not currently in place for Form 477. And where a challenge is successful, the location or locations that have been challenged as being deployed will be removed from the FCC's broadband map. And then finally, the broadband serviceable locations fabric. So what this is specified in the Broadband Data Act. It's something we've been looking at for a number of years. It is a database of all locations in the country that could be served by broadband, and that includes those that currently are served. But the broadband fabric itself will not include data about service or deployment. It's simply a data set of all locations that could receive service, and it will serve as the foundation for the new location-specific reporting that we'll be taking in from the providers. So on the fixed side, I should say. So the providers, when they submit a shapefile to us or lists of addresses or locations, those lists or the shapefiles will be overlaid onto the serviceable location fabric data, and it will yield a data set of those locations, of specific locations, and their status as either deployed or not deployed. And then that will be subject to stakeholder challenges. On the mobile side, it's a different type of collecting things that we've specified pursuant to the Broadband Data Act, parameters for mobile providers to develop coverage contours based on technical standards based on their network, and that will yield shapefiles based on the propagation studies, and then that will similarly be subject to challenge by stakeholders. So in the middle is our process that we will have certain outputs that will circle back to the data inputs. We will be validating the data in a variety of ways, including checking it for internal consistency and other possible anomalies or errors in the data, and then circling back with providers. We will be offering technical assistance to stakeholders, both on the deployment reporting side and on the challenge side, helping stakeholders participate in this process effectively. The challenge and the crowdsourcing process will feed back to the provider data and will affect what we ultimately include in the map. And we'll be conducting regular audits of provider data, that is doing a close look on a selective basis of what providers have submitted to ensure that they're following our requirements. So on the right side, we have the outputs and what this will result in for us. We'll ultimately have greatly improved public maps as a result of this. That will enable us to more precisely target our universal service funding so that we're doing it based on a location specific basis. And we'll have better data for our commission reports and analyses. And the data that we will be taking in and our maps themselves will be largely available publicly. There's very little that we're taking in that won't be available to all stakeholders. And so others will have the benefit of the data to conduct their own analyses. And obviously it will serve as the basis for the feedback that we get from stakeholders in terms of challenges and crowdsourcing. And I should mention, so there are, in addition to the formal challenge process, there is a crowdsourcing process that we have adopted pursuant to the Broadband Data Act that is a less formal process for submitting data that responds to what providers have submitted in the deployment data. So it's like a challenge process, but it does not trigger a formal obligation on the part of the provider to respond. So it's the challenge process will be the most involved process by which we resolve issues with the data. But the crowdsourcing process will provide us with informational data that we will use to inform our audit efforts. It will help us identify where there might be problems in the data, and where appropriate, take action. It could lead to enforcement action in certain instances, depending on the nature of the issue. So just to review what we'll end up with, the fixed broadband availability data will give us insight into individual locations in terms of deployment. The mobile broadband availability data will be standardized across providers. We don't have that now, and it will address that issue so that every provider will be subject to the same technical requirements as they develop their purported coverage. We'll have the challenge process that will help to refine the data, help us determine where deployment data submitted to us in the first instance is inaccurate, and remove that from the map. We'll be incorporating data from state, local, and tribal governments. The crowdsourcing information will help to support our efforts to verify the data, and we'll have audits and enforcement where appropriate. So in terms of what we've accomplished so far in the spring of this year, we have entered into a data architect and design services contract. This new collection will require the development of elaborate IT platforms that will need to work together for this all to work. And the data architect is working with us to make sure that as we develop these systems and as we roll them out, that they all work correctly and do what we need them to do, and that they work together. We also released a request for information for the fabric, the broadband serviceable locations fabric. We've received input on that, and that review of that input is ongoing, with the ultimate outcome being the selection of a provider, vendor to develop the fabric subject to our supervision. In more recently, so the RFI was a more general request for information. We released a request for proposals for the fabric development, and that's what we're currently reviewing the responses to. We entered into a contract for the development of the platforms. So this is in addition to the data architect who oversees the the processes and the design of the overall systems. We have entered into a contract for the development of the systems themselves. We released a bureau level public notice on the mobile challenge verification and crowdsourcing methodology. That was a document that we put out about a few weeks ago that is provides a highly technical details in terms of what we propose on the mobile challenge process side and how the mobile data will be validated and verified and challenged. And then more recently, we released a mobile map based on data received from the 4 largest mobile providers coverage based on the broadband data collection parameters. That is the new technical parameters that were adopted in the third report and order were used by the providers to submit their most recent Form 477 deployment data. So in other words, we're kind of getting a preview of what we'll receive on the mobile side in the broadband data collection through our existing Form 477 by getting the providers to submit the data as they would once the broadband data collection is in place. And those that map and the data sets that we received are available on the FCC's website. I can make the link to that available. I should say also that the main website that we've created for our broadband data collection efforts is fcc.gov and then /broadband data. And that's a central web page that where you can find information on all of these issues. And it's a good place to keep track of what we're up to. We put everything that we make available to the public on that location. So next steps, we need to make a determination on the broadband serviceable locations fabric vendor. We have other contracts that are in progress. We will release a public notice to announce the start of the data collection, and then the initial data collection and will take place, followed by publication of the initial maps. We'll be conducting outreach to tribes and small filers to provide support to them in their efforts to both to report deployment data and to challenge deployment data. We'll open up the submission window as part of the collection. We'll publish the maps, and then the challenge process will take place. We'll start, and that will initiate an ongoing process of reporting by providers, and then an opportunity for stakeholders to challenge and then or submit crowdsourced data that will feed back into the maps that will, we believe, on an ongoing basis result in better and better broadband maps as we go forward. So that's what I had in terms of presentation. I'll pause there, and I think we're doing Q&A at the end, I think.
That's correct, Kirk. Thanks so much. I'd like to let webinar participants know that we will go through all 3 presentations, and then we'll take questions and provide answers. So at this time, I would like to introduce our second speaker. Peggy Schaffer is the executive director of ConnectMaine. As executive director, Peggy manages the authority's rulemaking efforts, investment decisions, and policy recommendations. Peggy was the small business advocate for the Secretary of State's office and served as the co-chair of the Maine Broadband Coalition, a statewide group advocating for high-speed broadband. Peggy was the chief of staff in the Senate Majority Office and the Senate President's Office. Peggy also worked as the lobbyist for the Department of Economic and Community Development, where she helped develop and implement many of the state's key economic initiatives under both Governors King and Baldacci, and was part of the team of people that created Maine's research and development infrastructure. And Peggy, we welcome you today, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for inviting me. I am on a Starlink connection, so there may be some there may be some glitches, shall we say. So let's start here. Okay. So, the states have begun to take a lead on this broadband stuff. And one of the reasons is it's really important for us to understand what's going on in our state, because broadband is in fact a street by street battle. So, information is power. Sorry. Information is power. And controlling that information is really part of the power structures that ISP have had for a long time. And I strongly believe that it's really time to give that power to the people who are paying for this, the ratepayers, the taxpayers, and the consumers. And states in large part are doing a lot of that work. What do we need actually in states to do this work? We need a real understanding of who's served and not. And as you all know, in your communities, that can be one side of the street is served and the other side is not, for a whole variety of technical reasons. An understanding of what the basic infrastructure is that's already there, the understanding of what it's going to cost to build. If we're going to support a project, we need to understand what exactly is it the cost going to be to build out to those unserved homes. We need revenue models that inform the community decisions. So as a community begins to look at this, they can understand what the revenue model is, because these systems all have revenue, and how much is the whole, where is the whole they need funding for grants or from feds or from the community to make sure that provider can expand to people. They need an understanding of all the federal and state funding options and the requirements, and the requirements change. The FCC is the lead on most of the requirements for most of the federal stuff. USDA does have different requirements, and states vary, right? Our state, our minimum speed that we build to is 100 over 100. Our unserved data in Maine is 50. The FCC is still at 25.3, which, as we discovered in the pandemic, is really not adequate. A 3-up is not adequate for a family of 4 who have people who are working from home or learning from home or trying to do their business from home. A 3-up simply does not cut it. And they need a plan, very importantly, for digital inclusion, including affordability and what that looks like in their community, because it changes community to communities. There's some people who are who need service and can't afford it, and it's important for the community to understand as they develop their maps and as they develop an understanding of what's going on, who exactly. A series of 3 maps. We just put together an NTIA grant, which is the National Telecommunications and Information something, part of the Department of Commerce. They had a 288.
Peggy, I think you're frozen, and if you can hear me and would like to turn off your video, it might help.
Had to be a public entity. Am I unstable? Yes, I'm unstable.
Yeah, maybe if you turn off your video, it would help.
Okay, let's try
Thanks.
that. Okay. Here is what the FCC map says is served. This is a particular peninsula in Maine called the Blue Hill Peninsula. And the red areas are identified as unserved by the FCC, and the green areas are identified as served 25.3. And then the NTIA then takes data, in this case, Ookla data, and layers it on top of it to get a better picture of what's served and what's unserved. So this is the Ookla data that shows what's unserved. And you can see the dark red areas are the FCC. The other red areas are what the customer has said, I don't have service on. This is by census block, so it's a little big, but that is the Ookla data that shows sort of what is served. Maine has been engaged in a community planning process for a number of years. We've had an active process out on the towns on Blue Hill Peninsula who've been doing crowdsourced speed testing. Whoops, first map, sorry about this. So this is our state map. This is our on data that the providers give us about what's served and what's unserved. So you can see the orange is unserved, the red is unserved, and the green is served. This look at what really is going on the street level. Now, this is the crowdsourced data. So this is actual speed tests from people across the Blue Hill Peninsula about where service is and where service isn't. And you can, to some extent, it matches our map, and to some extent it matches the FCC map, but there's areas around here that we have identified through the FCC data are served that are not. These areas in here, they are not served. And so it's really important when we begin to look at how we're going to bring service to people that we really understand who has service and who does not, especially if you're going to be eligible for federal grants. So then we take this crowdsourced data and we employ a company called Vetro, and we add in the data that they have, some of the proprietary databases that they have, with a bunch of other information to layer it all together to look at a map like this. I know it looks a little confusing, but it does tell us sort of who is served and who is not, and where we should be focusing our efforts. So this data is the data we actually used when we put together our NTIAA application. So this tells us the pink is unserved, the
Peggy, I think we may have lost you.
done with both with Metro Fiber and with community mapping. So that is a key piece, right? We're going to apply for federal grants. We want to make sure that we can cover everybody that is eligible. And so therefore we have to be eligible. And so we need much better maps than what has been available. When we get ready to do our granting, this is what our Metro Fiber map is telling us. Who does not have service at which tiers? This allows us to do a couple things. It allows us to verify if the grants that we're getting are for areas that are unserved. And most importantly, it allows us to target areas in the state for outreach and to expand and improve service. This is the kind of information that states are gathering, that we're gathering to make sure that our grant money, that both state money and federal money that's coming in, can be used to target unserved and can really meet the needs of the communities that are out there. This is a really important data piece, and Maine, I think, is one of the first states that have employed a proprietary service called Metro Fiber Map to do this work. Interestingly enough, Metro Fiber Map mostly works with internet service providers, and Maine has a bunch of very small internet service providers, as well as some big players, and many of them use Metro Fiber. So our system really nicely meshes with the internet service provider system they use to design and build their network. This Metro Fiber Map also can give us an idea of what the costs are to build out the area. So when we get a grant in, or when we put a bid out for a grant, we will know sort of this is about what this area should cost to build. And that gives us a verification piece when providers come in with a grant, that we know that what we're paying for is to bring quality fiber, which in Maine is 100 over 100, to the locations that are identified on the map. It also very importantly allows us to identify where what we call orphans might be. So
Peggy,
go back to those providers and say, you need to cover this area, because what orphans are really hard to connect. So it's really important that we make sure that we cover all the areas that we can with our grants. So this is our speed test data that we have. We have about 23,000 people across the state who have engaged in this speed test. We have it up. We're doing this in partnership with the Maine Broadband Coalition, and we've pushed it out through a variety of things. And so these are the speed tests that have been taken. And the maps at this level do follow sort of the what we know about the service, right? So we know that those red areas are very badly served, and the green areas, which are sort of on the I-95 corridor in Maine are pretty well served. But you can see there's a lot of areas in the state that really do not have a quality service. And so what we're finding out, as you can see by this chart, is how many people in Maine do not have at least 25 megabits per second down, which is about 57% of the people. That's pretty extensive. So it's important for us to understand this data, both in terms of how we do outreach to communities, but in terms of how we use funding to distribute grant money. So what is it that we're looking for? You know, reliable data is essential to achieving any of the goals of universal service, which is our state goal. And it really does need to be granular. This has not been happening with the national maps. It's a significant problem. And, you know, one of the issues around this is that many federal programs are not, if an area has been auctioned off on an RDOF auction or the previous auction, then that area is no longer eligible for any federal money. So it's important that we begin to think about how we're going to fill in those holes for areas that the feds are considering served. We don't consider them served. So census blocks, polygons are actually not how networks are designed or built. We just had this problem with the NTIA grant. We had a couple census blocks. The NTIA grant really wanted block is drawn and the way the network is designed, you couldn't get there, right? The network came from a different direction in a census block that we weren't picking up. So we were not able to think about how
It seems like every time I say something,
data
she comes
points.
back in. Yay.
I'm in.
You're in now. Yeah.
Sorry.
No
So,
worries.
you know, I talked about how important it is to think about how networks are designed. In that case, more data points are needed to get a full picture of what's happening on the street. And that should be include the ability to add program priorities. Those priorities may be telehealth, they may be education, they may be areas of low income, but those are the kinds of priorities that states should be adding to their programs. It's not just about connecting people, it's about meeting the state's economic purpose, which is often not just connection, but what people actually are going to do with this network. Provider information, nature is a little biased, is not sufficient. And especially if you're using advertised speeds, not actually delivered. And customers ultimately pay for the service and their map. So their experience really should be represented as part of the data that we are collecting. Also, states have different broadband standards and goals. Maine is 100 over 100. Washington State's going to get to 150 over 150 by 2028, I think. But the federal standard is still a measly 25.3. So for us, the states, it's really important for us to really begin to think about how we get this data and how we do it. And there are a number of states across the country who have been collecting data. New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, Vermont, Alabama, Georgia, California, Washington, Michigan, Nebraska, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina have all been actively engaged in their own mapping service for their own funding, as well as for the federal funding. There is, as you may have heard, a chunk of federal money coming at us. We are shifting from an era of scarcity for funding for broadband to an era of abundance for broadband. It's really important that we understand where broadband is to be able to actually use this new federal money along with state money and provider money to bring universal service at a high enough quality that people have a network that they're going to use for the next next 50 years, right? If you're going to build this networks, we shouldn't be building them again. There's no reason to. We should be building networks that last 50 years. So all this data is really important as we plan right now for this additional federal money. So what gets measured gets done. If we can't measure it, we don't know where it is and we can't do it. And so that is an important piece of what drives our state strategy and what drives many state strategies. I'll be happy to answer questions about what we're doing if I'm still live.
Thank you, Peggy. I've got the same situation here in my home in Windham, Vermont. It's pouring rain. Thank you so much for another more potentially granular view. I'd now like to introduce, as I'll repeat that we will take questions at the end of this last presentation. And I would like to introduce our third presenter today. Brent Legg is Executive Vice President of Government Affairs for ConnectMaine. Brent has primary responsibility for leading ConnectMaine's government affairs and public policy team, working with federal, state, and local officials to advance legislation and/or executive actions that will improve access to and the quality of broadband service and related technologies. Brent has more than 10 years of experience working at the intersection of technology, politics, and public policy, and has provided expert testimony on broadband issues before the U.S. Congress and the legislatures of 12 states. Mr. Legg also has extensive experience working on education technology and school connectivity issues and is a recognized expert on the federal E-rate program. Welcome, Brent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's very good to be back and presenting before this group this morning. I hope my content is relevant and useful to you. There's a disadvantage, right, of going third among an excellent panel of speakers. So my colleagues, Peggy and Kirk, have already emphasized many of the points that I would like to make this morning. But I do hope that toward the end of my presentation, I can focus a little bit more on data validation and also talk about the need for mapping carrier interconnection and what that means and why that's important with regard to public policy. So let's dive into it, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end. So very quickly about ConnectMaine, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We were founded in Kentucky in 2001. We expanded to other states starting in 2007. We now do programmatic work in about 13 states across the country and have done work in more than 30 states. Our mission is very simple: to close the digital divide wherever it exists. And that means that we need to focus on everything from public policy to broadband mapping to data validation to state and local strategic planning, to tackling issues around school connectivity and the E-rate program. And then, of course, focusing on digital literacy and skills training, which is still a significant need as we see across the country. So we have about, as I mentioned, 13 active project states right now. And we are the broadband mapping partner for the states shaded in orange on your screen. So Michigan, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Tennessee, and Texas. And so we produce the state broadband availability map that those states use in the administration of their own state grant programs for broadband infrastructure. So very similar to the quote that Peggy had on her last slide: if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And that has been our philosophy on broadband mapping all along. We never set out to be a GIS broadband mapping organization. But we found out very early on in our work that you can't improve what you don't measure, right? So broadband mapping has been a key to our successful work over our 20-year history. There are three primary reasons to map broadband accurately, and there are a lot more than this. But first of all, to better inform decision making about where public resources should be invested to build out broadband. to avoid potential overbuild situations where service may already be available at a comparable speed and cost. Cost is also a factor. Just because broadband service is available someplace does not mean that it's affordable and can be attained by every user. So that cost is indeed an important factor. And then also to ensure accountability for ratepayer and taxpayer dollars once public investments have been made to support build out. And as I said, there are many more reasons beyond that. So I just want to, some of you probably remember my presentation from 2 years ago when I joined you in person in Wilmington, Delaware for one of the most recent conversations we've had as a group about this subject. I would say that the FCC's broadband data collection, which Kirk is very involved in administering, is really a game changer, not just for the federal government, but also for states. You heard me talk about the many deficiencies, and you heard Peggy talk about the many deficiencies of the FCC Form 477 data during her presentation earlier. We're finally moving away from that, and that is very exciting to see. So we're finally going to get broadband availability for fixed services that is mapped to individual locations, individual structures. And there will be a determination for whether or not an individual structure on a parcel of land is served or is not served. And that is a far more granular way of looking at broadband service availability than the FCC census block level data using Form 477. And then we'll also have mobile broadband availability by signal propagation, which, and there will be standardized, very conservative criteria applied across all mobile providers so that we'll get a much better depiction of where mobile service is also available. And this is a true game changer, I think, that was written into the Broadband Data Act that passed Congress last March that Kirk referred to during his presentation, that there will finally be an ongoing challenge process to scrutinize the data and continually improve the maps over time. And it's important as we're collecting data and scrutinizing that data, there's actually an underlying data set of structures on parcels so that we know where service can be married up to a given structure that warrants broadband service delivery. And that's what the broadband serviceable location fabric is. Kirk talked a little bit about it earlier. I'll show you an image of what that could look like here in just a second. And then the fact that we're going to have state, local, and tribal government data and crowdsourced data to support the challenge process and to support data validation, verification, and audit. And ultimately, that all of this and the resulting maps and the data behind the maps will be finally used to guide all future broadband funding programs at the federal level. And Kirk's comment about the fact that the vast majority of this data is going to be made available to states to consume in their own state broadband mapping programs, which is incredibly key. So this is an image of what the broadband serviceable location fabric could look like. And essentially the purpose here is to identify not only structures on parcels of land that warrant broadband service delivery, but which structure on a given parcel of land is the primary structure to which broadband service should be made available. And there are a variety of data sets essentially that get meshed together in order to create this fabric. But we think this is another element that is a key game changer in the FCC's new data collection process. And so what you see here on the screen here is an indication of all the structures on all the parcels of land. This particular view, I think, is in Missouri. And you can see that the buildings are shaded in pink. And the primary structure on a given parcel of land is the one with the green dot on top. And so as the FCC collects data from broadband service providers and challenges from qualified entities, ultimately, we're going to be seeing that data overlaid onto this serviceable location fabric. So we'll know whether or not a given structure falls within the coverage polygons that service providers are required to report. And they are held to account on which structures are indeed serviceable versus non-serviceable. So again, the level of granularity on this data is significant. I wanted to show you what sort of this looks like. This is Walton County, Florida. This was you may remember me talking about this project back in 2019, where we actually did an outside plant audit of all broadband infrastructure in Walton County, Florida. And we overlaid that information, which you see in purple, on top of what the FCC was reporting to be available via Form 477. And you can see that the actual served areas on a structure by structure basis are significantly less than what the Form 477 data were indicating in orange. And so this is the level of difference that I think we're going to see moving forward as the FCC transitions to the broadband data collection, the BDC. So should states care about broadband mapping? I think unequivocally everyone on this call would agree, yes. And the primary reason is to direct broadband funding with precision to unserved and underserved areas. And as Peggy alluded to in her comments a few minutes ago, there is a plethora of federal funding that is now available for states, or soon to be available for states, to direct in terms of broadband infrastructure projects. And what we've seen Congress do over the last year is largely direct the vast majority of funding through a federal agency, but down to the states for that decision making, which we think is actually a very good thing. We think states are best positioned ultimately to make a decision about where these investments should go. So, of course, the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which was included in the ARP Act back in March, which is $350 billion. It's available as block grants to state and local governments via the U.S. Treasury. Now, this money can be used for many purposes beyond broadband, but many states are using this money to invest in broadband build out. And secondarily to that, also included in the ARP Act was the Coronavirus Capital Projects Fund, $10 billion. And we're waiting for Treasury to release the rules on that program. But all of that money will be directed essentially toward broadband projects, and it will also be block granted down to states. And this is a particular fund that many state legislatures, as they were appropriating funds out of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund back in the spring, that many legislatures have not accounted for this additional influx of funding that we're awaiting from Treasury. A lot of you, I'm sure, are following the pending infrastructure bill. There is $42.5 billion for last mile broadband build out in the infrastructure bill. Assuming that that program stays largely intact as the bill makes its way through the House of Representatives, we may indeed see the largest injection of cash for last mile build out of any program that we've seen in history. And states are going to have a huge role in administering that funding if the bill stays as it's currently written. And then, of course, many of you may be from states that have also appropriated state funds for broadband infrastructure. All of this money needs to be directed some way, and it needs to be directed using accurate data. So states' roles in broadband mapping moving forward. So we certainly believe that states are going to continue collecting and mapping their own broadband data, and certainly that's certainly going to be the case until the FCC data is made available next year. It's likely that they're going to be independently collecting data even beyond the FCC data to augment that. And then it's also important for states to consider their role in carrying out data validation activities in order to participate in the FCC's future challenge processes. So as you heard Kirk refer to earlier in the presentation, states are going to have a very defined role in challenging the federal data where it needs to be challenged. States are certainly, because of the influx of federal and state funds on this subject, are going to be administering their own broadband infrastructure programs. It's also likely that states are going to have an increasing role in collecting and mapping middle mile infrastructure data, meaning the infrastructure that doesn't serve homes and businesses directly, but that facilitates ISPs and content delivery networks and their ability to reach communities that then can be translated into last mile access for homes and businesses. And then certainly collecting and mapping community anchor institution connectivity data. So schools, libraries, hospitals, and government agencies. Our organization actually runs a program called Connect K-12 at connectk12.org, where we track school district broadband availability and the speeds and prices that school districts are paying for service for every school district in the nation. So please visit connectk12.org and check out what's going on in your communities and how much your communities or how much your school districts are paying for the service they receive. A big part of what we do is infield data validation, so confirming or disputing what service providers have reported. So you can see here all of the different things that we, some examples of the different things that we look for as we send our engineering team out into the field to do data collection. This is going to be an ongoing, very important process as states think about participating in the FCC's challenge processes under the BDC. And that's important not just for fixed services, but also for fixed wireless services and for mobile services. So if your state does not have a plan for collecting this data, validating the data, and ultimately participating in the FCC's challenge process, now is the time to get organized and prepared to do that. So very quickly, I wanted to show you what it looks like when you collect mobile speed test data to participate in a challenge process. So a couple of years ago, the FCC launched a program called the Mobility Fund Phase 2, and they launched a challenge process to give states a role in challenging that data. So we did that on behalf of the state of Kansas. We collected 187,000 individual tests across the state of Kansas. And what you see here on the screen is one particular county where we conducted tests, and the tests that were conducted in red there failed, and we reported that to the FCC as such. The tests in green were tests that succeeded based on the criteria that the FCC gave us. So as you can see, the vast majority of tests in this particular county that we administered actually failed, and we reported that information to the FCC. Ultimately, 119,000 tests of the 187,000 tests that we conducted across the state of Kansas failed, a 64.03% fail rate. We were able to delineate those qualifying tests, or excuse me, passing tests and failing tests by service provider, so we could see which providers were indeed overstating their coverage. Ultimately, we were able to challenge an area of more than 5,000 square miles in Kansas, which was a little bit smaller than the size of the state of Connecticut, which is a significant area for a lot of people who were being told that they were being served, and they actually were not. So I mentioned earlier the importance of mapping middle mile infrastructure, not just thinking about last mile into homes and businesses, but where are there potentially other deficiencies in your internet experience? And I'm curious, among this group, how many of you have ever thought about how service providers connect to one another, or how content and cloud services like Netflix and Amazon deliver those services efficiently to internet service providers and then ultimately to end users? It's actually the case that network interconnection happens in data center-like buildings called internet exchange points, or IXPs. IXPs provide a physical home where networks can meet and exchange traffic, usually at no cost to one another. And this is what's referred to as peering. Internet service providers, streaming providers, social networks, financial institutions, mobile phone companies, cloud companies like Google, all of them have a physical presence in these IXPs in order to exchange traffic in the most agile way. And IXPs actually shorten the distance that some traffic needs to take in order to get to its destination, resulting in what's called reduced latency and allowing local traffic to stay local. There are many functions, important functions that internet exchange points play. As I mentioned, it facilitates peering between local ISPs, it keeps traffic local, significantly reduces latency, provides a home for cloud and content delivery networks. They provide reduced wholesale IP transit costs for local ISP because there are multiple IP transit carriers in IXPs. They increase network resiliency, and they serve as an aggregation hub for school connectivity, which is an important function in reducing the cost of service and the quality of, and increasing the quality of service for K-12 school districts. So we've actually mapped the locations of all internet exchange points in the country. There are 57 cities in the US where IXPs are located. So literally all US internet traffic ultimately is exchanged at one of these pinpoints on this map. And there are actually 17 states that do not have an internet exchange point at all. And that was when we learned this was shocking to me, that there are literally 17 states that have to send all of their internet traffic elsewhere only to come back into their state on another network, which is incredibly inefficient. And so we believe that there are at least 100 cities in the country that warrant the development of new internet exchange points at a cost of about $2 to $3 million per facility. So as your states are thinking about broadband service, the quality of broadband service, the cost of broadband service, the final point that I wanted to make today is also think about carrier interconnection. Think about whether or not your state actually has the opportunity to exchange traffic among networks to provide a home for cloud and content in your state. And in some cases, multiple ones within states are needed. Think about that and think about how the internet landscape can improve just beyond last mile access. Because that too very much matters. Especially as the internet evolves and the Internet of Things, where there's an IP address attached to every appliance and car and mobile device in the country. This is a key element of the internet ecosystem that has up until this point been largely overlooked. Thankfully, Congress has begun to recognize this, and in the infrastructure bill, there's actually a middle mile program that's funded at $1 billion, in which not just middle mile fiber, but also other elements of the internet ecosystem are also eligible for funding, including carrier neutral internet exchange points and submarine cable landing stations, which is another issue that I won't get into today. But be thinking about these issues too as these federal funds become available. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions with my fellow panelists. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for your time, Brent. We really appreciate it. And I do remember your presentation in Wilmington. It was really fantastic. So thank you again for coming. I see a question in the chat that came in, and let's see, I'm going to sort of slide through them. I see a question from Carrie Warner, and this came in when Kirk Burgee was giving his talk. So she says, New York is not an FCC state. Will providers in New York be included in the new coverage mapping? Kirk, could you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. They will. It's a nationwide collection. New York had a separate program during the Connect America Fund Phase 2 program auction, Phase 2 auction. But that's a separate issue from the mapping. Every state is treated equally for this purpose.
Great. Thank you. And if anybody has questions or follow-ups, you can type them into the Q&A and I will answer that, or I won't answer them for sure. I'll take them in the order they came. One of my colleagues from Vermont, Mike Yantachka from Charlotte, has a question. And he said, and I think this was directed toward Peggy. He said, workforce availability will be crucial for successful build out. Is Maine doing anything to train new line workers?
We are. It's one of the pieces that we're looking at as we move forward. We have one of our local ILEX has been working with their local technical high school to train line workers. And it is a huge issue. One of the big things with all this federal money coming down, in addition to the projects that big ISPs are to take, workforce and supply chain, it's going to be huge. Like the availability of fiber and the availability to people to hang fiber, which is an excellent opportunity for states to expand their workforce. So we know it's going to be an issue. We've been working closely and we're talking with our community colleges and others about how we can ramp up this process.
Thank you, Peggy. And there is a comment from Shirley Gerard, who is, she is the CSG East Health Policy Consultant and GWEP Co-Director for SUNY Downstate. And she says, and I don't, it's not exactly a question, but she said, I think about this a lot in healthcare and especially related to care of older adults. So would anybody like to comment on that and the importance of this in terms of healthcare?
Well, I mean, I think, we're a rural state, like upstate New York and Vermont and New Hampshire. For us, what the pandemic has taught us is I think people were relatively recalcitrant, or they weren't really ready to use telemedicine yet because of, a whole variety of things. You want to see your doctor. But the pandemic has really changed that tremendously, and people are now very interested. So now we know, but when you think about how we expand services to community, it's all about take rate. It's about how many people take the service. And so there's an additional demand that telehealth provides that helps actually figure out how you're going to expand and build out a network. It's really important to connect the last mile. It's really important. Many of the telehealth grants connect the facilities, but if we don't connect the patients, we're not actually expanding the opportunity that telehealth has. So for both elderly people, for mental health, for drug treatment, telehealth is a significant piece, but the missing link in that, especially in the funding, is the last mile, how we connect the actual patients to the facilities.
Yeah, and Brent, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think Peggy's absolutely right. And it's the quality of those connections too, right? It has to facilitate the type of interaction that's necessary for the patient to get the best care. And so there are all kinds of reasons, right, why a telehealth connection between a patient and a doctor, a patient and a facility can be poor. Some of the, I would say that the advent of the SpaceX Starlink network has been something that has been a great thing for rural communities and will increasingly help rural communities, but it's not perfect. And as we've seen, Peggy's own connection there has paused a few times during her presentation. And that would definitely be the same sort of thing that users of telehealth would experience as well, which can affect the quality of care. So while the connection works most of the time, it doesn't work all of the time. And that's a significant challenge for especially older adults that may be uncomfortable with technology anyway, and may struggle to know what the reason is behind that connection dropping off. And so I think it's really important for us to think about network quality and reliability, and things like reducing latency and improving two-way video performance, which is another reason why carrier neutral interconnection, internet exchange points are important for states to consider as an element of their network design.
So Shirley has a follow-up, and I'll just read that. And then I see Tara has her hand up. Shirley says, we have this problem in urban areas too. Travel time can be a barrier to access in New York City. Also, ability to connect providers one to another and to patients. It's a problem in coordination of care. So I don't know that you might want to comment, you don't have to, but.
So I would say this is one of the problems of having the FCC define broadband as 25.3 is that, and also one of the problems of the traditional FCC mapping is that the urban area, there are a lot of urban areas who are essentially redlined. They have very bad service, especially, I mean, if you think about the same reason that rural areas haven't got services, the same reason that some urban areas have poor service is that there's not really enough take rate, there's not really enough money, there's not an ability for the provider to make its money back. And one of the problems with all these definitions of 25.3, so we don't overbuild these networks, is there are networks that are really crappy in urban areas where lots and lots of people live that great and need better service. And so if we're thinking about how we connect America for the purpose of telehealth, education, workforce, we have to look at everything, not just the rural areas. We have to look at the urban areas. And some of that is affordability and some of it's quality. So those are really critical pieces that we put together, that we need to put together as we go forward here. And that's, you know, one of the big pushbacks on the American Rescue Plan money was the initial thing that you couldn't spend this money on anything other than 25.3. So cities who were getting a lot of American Rescue Plan money at the beginning couldn't use this money to improve service. And that's a problem that we have to address.
Thanks, Peggy. I see there's a question from Laura Sibilia, which I can read. We have good time left. So Tara, why don't you go and then I'll read the question from Laura, also one of my Vermont colleagues.
Thank you, Carolyn. I think Peggy just answered my question, but I too am very, very concerned about not only accessibility of these showing on these maps, but also affordability for the lower income people. I don't think that it's fair or equitable to have whole areas where people can see it, but they can't afford to have it. Is there any money coming down that will pay for these people to actually get decent quality internet access?
I don't know who that's a question for. Peggy, go ahead. Maybe Kirk wants to.
Well, Kirk should answer this because they have $3.4 billion now for the emergency broadband benefit, and the new infrastructure plan ramps that up to 14 point something billion. So there is additional funding in there that for that service. I also think some of this infrastructure money can be used to build lower cost networks, which helps that broadband benefit piece. So
thanks, Peggy. Brent, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I agree with what Peggy just said. The infrastructure bill actually makes the emergency broadband benefit program permanent. It changes the name to the Affordable Connectivity Program. It will continue to be administered by the FCC. The per month benefit drops actually in the bill from $50 per month to $30 a month, but the eligibility expands to 200% of the federal poverty line. So more people will become eligible for the service. And so I was doing an interview yesterday with S&P, and the reporter asked me the question, well, what's the net effect of that, right? And would that amount, would that reduction in cost actually result in inhibiting the effect of the program on low-income families? And I said, I think what we'll probably see is that internet service providers will adapt to that subsidy amount and will likely tailor packages that meet the federal criteria that the FCC sets, but that will ultimately be available in that $30 or so a month range. And it's also the case, as I understand it, the bill is written so that if someone wants to subscribe to a higher tier of service, then they can still use that benefit as a discount off of a more expensive package, which I think is important for families that may have multiple children, for instance, and may all need to be online, at the same time. So I'm very encouraged. The House of Representatives may do something additional to those provisions in that infrastructure bill as the House takes that up. So we'll see what comes when the House makes its changes.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. I think that, this has been an issue in my town. I was a very, very rural town for years and years. I can remember a time when there was fiber service to the school and to the town clerk's office, and kids who needed to go online, especially high school kids, would come and park in front of the school after hours to be able to work on it. So things have changed a bit. There's better service here, but it's not great. I think I have 7 megawatts, per second. So, anyway, there is a question from my colleague, Laura Sibilia, in the chat, and it's a question for Kirk. And she says, it looks like the infrastructure bill qualifying speeds as 120. Can Kirk talk about the likelihood and timeliness of seeing the FCC broadband definition change? And a plug from Vermont for the speed to be symmetrical, 100 and not 120. So, Kirk?
Sure. So the way the FCC makes those determinations is pursuant to a provision of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Section 706 of that act, which we continue to refer to it as. So it's a process that takes place on a 6 month cycle, and we release a notice of inquiry and then release a report based on the input that we get pursuant to the notice of inquiry. And we would expect to be opening that up for input at some point in the future. But aware of those concerns in terms of the adequacy of the current standard, and that will be taken into account. I encourage you to participate in that proceeding once it's open, because it's valuable input for us to hear that.
And she has a follow-up comment. She says, honestly find the affordability question as a bit of a red herring in Vermont, a conversation being driven by the Comcast and AT&Ts to divert community broadband dollars toward temporary subsidies of their existing less than desirable networks. The build out of fiber allows for telephone, TV, and internet in one network. She says, regardless, 14 billion should do it. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that or but that's, Laura is one of our broadband gurus in the state of Vermont, especially Southern Vermont. Are there any other questions? I'm glad Tara brought up, even though Laura says that the affordability question is a bit of a red herring. I have been concerned for folks who might really need the service, but young families, maybe with multiple kids, who do not have the kind of income that would be able to support more expensive service, but would be so necessary for them. So I just think one of our principles should be that as many people who need the service be able to afford it. Tara's hands up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I hate to hog everything, but question about this mapping the whole procedure. Kirk, it sounds wonderful. I'm so glad that you're doing it. What is the timetable? I mean, how long is it going to take for these computers to get up and running and have the mapping and the data available to everyone?
Yeah, great question. I wish I had something specific I could share today. There's obviously a lot going on. Currently, we're trying to get it done as quickly as we can, but there's a a lot of work to do and a number of issues that are factors that aren't under our direct control. But having said that, we are trying to get it done as quickly as we can. We have said that we will provide 6 months notice in advance of the opening of the initial filing window. And so I would look out for that as an indication that it's beginning to move forward.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kirk. Any other questions? I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A or in the chat. Brian Richardson says, happy to know everyone had a good time in Wilmington. We enjoyed hosting the event. I really enjoyed being there. I flew down with Laura and learned something about how much she loves air travel. My hand still hurts. And Shirley says, thank you so much for a great session. I have to go to another meeting, so we'll leave you. Let me know what I can do to mobilize nurses and others in the healthcare community to advocate for what is needed. And David says, David Biet, our executive director, says, acknowledging Shirley Gerard's, and I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly, comment in the Q&A, rural broadband is a huge issue, but there are many issues in the inner city that keep people from connecting from availability to cost. So if there is any, if there are any other comments, speak now or we will wrap things up. We're a little early. There's time for a little bit more if you have any questions. I really think this has been, well, Peggy, you showed your face. So do you have something you wanted to add? Okay.
No, I mean, I think that the issues around affordability is really critical. You know, there's been talk in the Broadband Leaders Network, the State Leaders Network, about, you know, this issue of underwriting networks that are not great with service. But I just think that's part of what we got to do, right? We have to make sure people get the internet connection, and sometimes it's not going to be a great connection, but it's going to be the only connection they have. And so I think that it's 2 tracks that have to go simultaneously. Well, 3. One is better data. One is the how we build out, making sure as we build it out, it becomes affordable. And 3, underwriting the cost for those who can't afford it. Those are the 3 tracks that we have to keep working on. Also, the other track is the digital literacy. People have to know how to use the internet and have a device.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate everyone's participation today. I've said, probably everybody's sick of hearing me say this, I think broadband and internet is magical. And I'm just really thrilled when it works and really, really, really frustrated when it doesn't. And so I appreciate everybody. Every time I participate in one of these panels or come to a seminar or symposium and listen, I learn a little bit more. And I really appreciate all of you for participating. Thank you, Kirk, Burgee, Brent Legg, and Peggy Schaffer for doing this. We appreciate your time and your ability to describe things so that even folks like myself can understand what this is all about. And I want to ask everybody to watch out for policy summits and special events in months to come that we may be doing, and hopefully in person. Next year, we will be having our annual meeting in New Hampshire and Manchester. I think it's Manchester or Concord, Manchester. And I'm not remembering the dates off the top of my head, which Allison Braver will probably chastise me for, but maybe somebody could put it in the chat. But we all look forward to seeing folks in person, God willing, and the creeks don't rise next year in New Hampshire. So thank you all. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the CSG annual meeting.
Thank you, everyone.